Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is the podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I have now completed a full week of working from home, of staying at home, of doing my best to flatten the curve to help that process. Hopefully I am, helping to do that. I don't know. Hopefully you are doing the same thing as well. And if you need something to do, well, then podcasts are the way to go. Although you're already listening to this podcast, so it's not like I'm convincing you to listen to a podcast. Thank you for listening to this podcast. I very much appreciate it, as I always appreciate you, my listeners. So today, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, we do have another interview. This time I interviewed author Greg Hickey about his new book, The Friar's Lantern, which is, let me just read you the description and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. The description is as follows. You may win $1 million. You will judge a man of murder. An eccentric scientist tells you he can read your mind and offers to prove it in a high-stakes wager. A respected college professor exacts impassioned, heat-of-the-moment revenge on his wife's killer a week after her death, and you're on the jury. Take a Turing test with a twist. Discover how your future choices might influence the past and try your luck at 3-card Monte. And while you weigh chance, superstition, destiny, intuition, and logic in making your decisions, ask yourself, are you responsible for your actions at all? Choose wisely if you can. All right, so there's a lot of interesting things going on in this book. First of all, you are the protagonist. You probably gathered that from the description. So there's that. It's also a book that has a lot of different kinds of philosophy in it that are present in both of the timelines. The timeline where you might win $1 million from that eccentric scientist, and the timeline where you are on a jury. I mentioned before that I was on jury duty a couple of months ago. It was a criminal case, and so I kept obviously I had that courtroom in my head when I was reading this book, but also I kept being like, wait, that didn't happen at my trial. Wait, that's not what they said. Yeah, because my one jury duty experience totally makes me an expert on every state's jury and trial processes. Yeah, you know how you do that when you read books. You're always comparing things that you've done or know in that process. So you are the protagonist. Lots of different kinds of philosophy, and it is a choose-your-own-adventure book. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who loved to read, and it just so happens that when she was a child, let's say 8 or 9, don't remember exactly, choose-your-own-adventure books became extremely popular. Being a kid who loved to read and loved to read new books that were coming out and having an older brother who loved choose-your-own-adventure books, she desperately wanted them for her birthday. And she got them because her parents loved to buy her books. She soon learned she was terrible at choose-your-own-adventure books. She never once made it to the end appropriately. Ever. No matter how many times she would go back and try to make it through, she would never make it through to the end where you don't die or you don't get told that you have failed miserably. Yes, that little girl, of course, was me. I was terrible at choose-your-own-adventure books. And so when I started reading this one, I was like, oh man, I'm going to die. It's not that kind of choose-your-own-adventure. You will not die if you read this book, figuratively or otherwise. I hope. I mean, otherwise, literally, that would be really, really bad. But it is, if you grew up with those books and you want an adult version, you should definitely check this one out. And as it happens, I do have copies to give away, so stay tuned to the end of the episode and we'll talk about how you can win a copy of The Friar's Lantern by Greg Hickey. In the meantime, we will go ahead now and turn to the interview so Greg can tell you more about the book. Hi, Greg. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much for having me.
I am happy to have you here. We are here to talk about your newest book called The Friar's Lantern. Before we get to the book, though, if you could share a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit, that would be great.
Sure. So, as you said, my name is Greg Hickey. I write, or at least I try to write, entertaining stories for smart readers. So, Friar's Lantern is my second book. I wrote a very brief novella after that. I'm currently working on another book. They're all in different genres, at least the standardly defined genres, but they all follow that approach of trying to provide entertaining stories for smart readers. Aside from being an author, I am a forensic scientist by day. So I work in a crime laboratory helping police officers solve crimes. I work in the firearms section of a laboratory with the Illinois State Police in Chicago. So that basically means that I get guns and bullets and cartridge cases from crime scenes, and my job is to try to tell the police if a certain bullet or certain cartridge case from a crime scene was fired by a particular gun. So I'm a forensic scientist by day and an author by my lunch breaks, weekends, evenings, whenever else I have time. In addition to that, I grew up playing a lot of sports. By the time I got to high school, I began to focus on baseball. I played baseball throughout high school, and I played in college. And then after that, I played overseas in Sweden and South Africa. Came home, went back to school, and got a master's degree in forensic science. So I grew up, being active, being competitive. Once I was finished with baseball, I found that I needed another competitive outlet. So I took up endurance training and endurance racing. So I've done a few marathons. I've done several triathlons. So that's kind of where I am now in terms of my physical practice. So all those things blend together, and writing is obviously a big part of it.
All right, thank you. The forensic scientist stuff sounds fascinating. I think we could do a podcast on that, except that we're on the wrong podcast.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you a question now that's going to sound like I'm being mean, but I'm just being facetious. Why do you hate me? So I've said on the podcast before that I get a lot of books to read, and I don't always I usually just grab the one that's for the next week to read and start reading it, and I don't always remember, who I've talked to and what it's about, et cetera. And so I start reading this one, and I get to the bottom of page, 10, and it says, if you choose to sign, go to page 11. And I'm like, no, it's a choose your own adventure. I'm going to die. I was terrible at choose your own adventure books as a kid. I think I have PTSD.
Oh, no. Well, the good thing is you can always go back and revise your choice.
Exactly. So I was just being silly, but that was my initial reaction on page 10 of, oh no, how many times am I going to die?
Right.
I didn't die at all. It's not that kind of book.
No.
Yes. With that
no reader will die in this book.
Yes, that's right. With that very silly introduction, can you give an overview of the book?
Sure. So as you said, The Friar's Lantern is written as a choose your own adventure book, which means that the reader is the protagonist and the story is told in second person. So you woke up, you went to school, you went to work. It's all written in that style. Throughout the story, the reader will have opportunities to choose how the plot continues. So like you said, on page 10 the choice is if you choose to sign the consent form and participate in the study, turn to page 11. If you choose not to sign the consent form, turn to page 18. And so the story proceeds like that. There's sections of prose, and then there's sections where the reader has to make choices about how the story will continue. Now, there are two main plot threads for The Friar's Lantern, as we alluded to with that first choice. The first one is you are participating in a research study where you go through an MRI brain scan, and while you're in that scan, you watch this video of a scenario in which you're basically kind of in a wager situation that could land you with $1 million, or you could end up with nothing. And as you go through this video and the MRI scan, the researcher tells you that he's going to try to use the data from the MRI scan to try to predict what you're going to do when you make this wager, this choice. Then there's another thread of the story that picks up a little bit later where you are summoned to jury duty and you're asked to decide whether or not a man is guilty of killing a burglar who broke into his home and apparently murdered his wife. And so the man on trial is accused of having killed his wife's murderer a week after the incident occurred. And so those are the two main story threads, and they continue out throughout the bulk of the book, and then various plot threads weave in and out depending on what you, the reader, choose throughout the story.
Let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, Greg will talk about what inspired him to write this particular book with all of these different elements. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you the Bible Study Podcast. Reflect and journey the Bible as together we study God's Word and be inspired. Bible study made fun and informative for all ages. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Bible Study Podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Greg Hickey about his new book, The Friar's Lantern. So what was your initial inspiration for both the storylines as well as the style of the book?
I came up with the idea for a Choose Your Own Adventure book first. And when I say I came up with the idea, I realized later on that I was not the first person to have an idea for adapting a Choose Your Own Adventure format that I had read as a kid and adapting that for an adult audience. There have been other authors who have done this, and they were probably either writing it at the time that I was thinking this, or at the very least had already thought of doing this. Again, moving a Choose Your Own Adventure book into the adult genre. But I came up with this idea probably almost 15 years ago now when I was still in college. And as I thought about this question today and kind of the origin of it, I wonder if it goes back to a point in college when I was a freshman, when I go to the dining hall, occasionally I would go with friends, occasionally, I just go in after I finish with class or after I finish with baseball practice, and I wasn't expecting to meet anyone there, or I was before my friends would arrive or after my friends had already eaten. So I ended up eating alone, and I didn't necessarily mind eating alone, but, after 2 or 3 times, if I just didn't happen to be there with anyone, I would bring a book along, and I would store it in a cubby in the dining hall. And so the first book I brought along was Labyrinth, a collection of short stories by Jorge Luis Borges, the famous Argentinian short story writer. So I'd read a short story, on 8, put the book back in the cubby, and then go back to my dorm and go wherever I was going on to next. And for those who have read him, Borges is this very cerebral writer, comes up with these very elaborate, convoluted scenarios, sort of science fiction, sort of magical realism, where there's these kind of crazy plot structures and sort of confusing and bewildering and maze-like, and they're fascinating and really well written. But I think maybe that sort of sparked the idea of, okay, these Choose Your Own Adventure books that I read as a kid, they're kind of doing the same thing where they're putting the reader in this crazy world, and the reader has to kind of think about the scenario they're in, the maze that they're in, and try to figure their way out. But Borges is obviously doing this for a much more mature audience. Would it be possible to take, a kid's book, a Choose Your Own Adventure book, and adapt it for a more mature audience? So that was kind of the initial idea. And probably a year or two later, while I was still in college, I was in a college philosophy class and we were assigned to read about a philosophy problem called Newcomb's problem. And Newcomb's problem was developed in the 1960s by, I believe, a theoretical physicist named William Newcomb, who came up with this choice scenario. And the research experiment in the Friar's Lantern is based on Newcomb's problem on this choice scenario. So it's adapted to make it, I think, more realistic by introducing the idea of an MRI machine that's used to read your brain and predict what you're going to do. But the basic parameters are very similar to Newcomb's original problem. So in Newcomb's problem, it became a relatively famous philosophical thought experiment that on the surface level is basically about how you choose and how your brain functions in the process of choosing. And then as you kind of go a step deeper, it's about whether or not humans are actually free to choose, or whether your brain just kind of takes information in and dictates what you're going to do without you actually having any conscious control. So it's about free will versus determinism. And I thought this problem was absolutely fascinating. And the incredible thing about Newcomb's problem is that anyone who reads it basically has a very convincing, or is very convinced that you should make one choice. It's very difficult to convince someone that they should do what's the opposite choice. The problem is that people are split about 50-50 on what you should choose when it comes to Newcomb's problem. And I think, having talked to a lot of people about the scenario in the Friar's Lantern and about Newcomb's problem in general, I found that to be the case, that people are really evenly divided on what they should do and what they think about free will and determinism. And each side is absolutely convinced that they're right, and it's pretty unshakable. So that was kind of the initial scenario for the Friar's Lantern. And then I decided that I wanted to kind of take it a step further. So the problem of whether or not you can choose also has a lot to do with the problem of whether or not you are responsible for your actions. So, in our typical justice system, we think that criminals choose to do wrong, therefore they are guilty and they're responsible for their actions, and it makes sense to put them in prison. The problem is if criminals don't actually choose to commit crimes, that they're just a product of their environment or their genes or some aberration in their brains. It's not clear that they are responsible for their actions in the traditional sense. And then the question is, well, do they deserve to be punished? How should we handle them in this situation? So the second scenario of the man who's accused of killing his wife's murderer is kind of a takeoff on that little more moral aspect of the free will question.
All right, thank you. Yeah, it's not a terribly long book, but there's a lot going on in terms of the things to think about and things to ponder for the two different timelines. Can you talk about the title of the book, The Friar's Lantern, and where that comes into play?
Sure. And just as you mentioned, it's not a very long book, which is by design, because I'm hoping that, as we talked about earlier, readers will be able to go back and explore different scenarios. So rather than have it be a 500-page book that is a task to get through just in the first place, I wanted to keep it relatively short so readers would feel able and even compelled to go back and choose other scenarios and see what happens. But the title, The Friar's Lantern, refers to a phenomenon that's also known as a will-o'-the-wisp or a jack-o'-lantern. It's basically when travelers were going through swamplands in times before electric lights and vehicles, they would often see the swamp gases coming up off the marsh and then glowing or phosphorescing in the night. So these little ghostly lights that they would see, and the fear was that the lights would lead them astray, thinking that someone was out there, thinking that they could find shelter in the direction of the light, and they might wander off the safe path and go into a deep marsh or somewhere that they couldn't escape, or that would be dangerous for them. So the Friar's Lantern kind of refers to that idea of you're moving through this book on a path, and there are these choices all the time, and as the reader, you're trying not to be led astray. You're trying to get through the book on the safest and the for you, for the main character, as possible.
Cool. Thank you for that. You get that theme a lot in fantasy books in various different forms of what kind of creatures are trying to lure you into the marsh or into the swamp. Yeah. What kind of research did you do for the book?
Quite a lot. So, I started writing the book, like 2 or 3 years after I graduated from college. So I went back and read all my old little philosophy papers, did some additional research into the philosophy around Newcomb's problem and around free will. Went back and read some more Borges to see how he had, worked out his scenarios and worked out his stories. I read a few, what I then discovered, some already published adult choose your own adventure novels, and I read through those to see how those stories were structured, see how they, how long the prose sections were, where they branched, where they led to, how, where actual choices were placed in the physical structure of the book, whether beginning at the end or at the end. And then there's also, all these scenarios that weave in and out of the story. So I had to do some research on the legal process and what a trial looks like. And I had some experience from my graduate schooling in forensic science and from my early experience as a forensic scientist, because part of my job is I will actually have to go to court fairly often and testify on what I find. So I kind of drew on that and did some additional legal research, and then researching stuff like religion, which comes into play, the Turing test, which comes into play. So all sorts of things that sort of weave in and out of the story and deal with how we choose, how our minds work in the process of choice.
Fascinating. That's just a lot of in-depth research. You must either really enjoy research or you're just very focused.
I do, and it was it was fascinating to kind of see how all these things interconnect. So there's obviously some heavy philosophy reading, which to some people is kind of dry, but that was my major, so in part I enjoyed it, and I'm trying to make the Friar's Lantern not be a philosophical treatise. I'm hoping that it's also entertaining for readers, but can also shed some light on these interesting ideas. But then there's also ideas like computer chess. I dove into computer chess and figure out, how computer chess worked, how these algorithms have continued to improve over time. So, yeah, very diverse and really very interesting throughout.
Time for break number 2. When we come back, we'll be talking about you, actually, as the main character. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Greg Hickey, and as I said before the break, we are about to talk about you. Not behind your back. We're going to talk about you with you right here in the podcast, listening to the podcast. So let's return to that interview. Now, normally I ask about the main character, but as you mentioned, this is written in the second person, so the reader is the main character. So what kinds of challenges, if any, or maybe what kinds of fun things did you find about writing in this way?
Yeah, so I mean, that was something I was very conscious of early on. Is how do I get not only the main character but some of the secondary characters as well to make it feel for the reader like they are actually the main character. They can identify with the main character. They can sort of recognize aspects of people that they know in the people they encounter in the book. And one of the early reviews that I got, which still amazes me, is that a female reviewer wrote that this is the story of a young woman who volunteers to participate in an experiment, et cetera, et cetera. And I was struck by that because one of the things I wanted to do was make the character approachable for every reader. So I was glad that I had a female reader who thought that I had intended the main character to be a young woman, just like she was. So I felt like, that was good feedback that I was at least on the right track with how I structured that. So the main character, at least, I tried to make pretty general, pretty universal, so that any reader could feel like they could identify with how this character was thinking, the actions they were performing, the choices they were asked to make. And then some of the secondary characters I tried to do in a similar way. So there's kind of two main secondary characters. One is the friend of the protagonist, whose name is Eve. Another is another juror on the criminal trial, whose name is John Mann. So obviously, the names of the characters themselves suggest these universal male and female characters, and they're supposed to be sort of general characteristics that any reader will recognize as, being part of someone they know. But also, I wanted these characters to have a life of their own, to have personalities of their own, so that they're interesting characters, but still sort of recognizable for the reader. So it's kind of a little bit of a tricky balance there, trying to make these characters work for this story.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine it would be easy to get sidetracked from writing in that voice, because we don't often write in that voice.
Right.
So, yeah. You have a book before this one. It's called Our Dried Voices. Do you want to speak a little bit about that book as well?
Sure. So, yes, Our Dried Voices was my first novel. It's a dystopian fiction novel about a future human colony on a distant planet. So basically, this is set hundreds of years in the future. Humans have escaped from Earth after Earth succumbs to world wars and global warming and overpopulation. So some humans escape on a spaceship. They set up a colony on a distant planet, and they set it up so that the colony basically takes care of the humans, and the humans don't have to do anything anymore. So everything in the colony is automated, from cleaning the buildings to producing food to controlling the weather. And the humans in the colony basically are these kind of happy-go-lucky, blissfully innocent people who spend their days playing and eating, and don't have any input into sustaining their lives. And everything goes along very peacefully for them until some of the machines in the colony start to break down. Sort of one by one, a different colonist emerges and starts to figure out how the colony works and what's going wrong. And then all of a sudden, that colonist disappears. And eventually it falls to the main character, whose name is Samuel, to really step forward, figure out what's going on, figure out if someone's behind it, and if so, who they are, and decide how the colony is going to move forward or not.
Sounds kind of creepy, actually, but fascinating, but fascinating and interesting. So you mentioned that you are working on some things now. Can you talk a little bit about what you're working on?
Yes. So I'm very close to finishing my next novel, which at this point is titled Parabellum. It's sort of a literary crime novel about a fictional mass shooting incident that occurs in my hometown of Chicago. So basically follows four main characters in the year leading up to this attack and investigates how or why each of those characters might be involved in the incident. So I finished the major edits on it this past weekend. I then turned it over to my wife, who is probably the most deliberate and careful reader that I know, and so she makes a perfect last stage proofreader to catch any final typos or grammatical errors. And then I'm hopefully going to be able to get it out this fall.
All right. Thank you for that. And you have had a very interesting arc of career choices. So was writing something that you always wanted to do, or is it something that you came to kind of later in life? How did that work for you?
It is something that I found fairly early in my life as a student. And it's something I kind of discovered fairly early on that I really enjoyed doing. I specifically remember being in junior high school and being assigned to write this short story for class, and it was about a cruise ship that basically shipwrecks and some of the passengers escape on lifeboats and they're stranded on the island. And it's sort of a adult Lord of the Flies survivor type scenario with these cruise ship passengers. And I really enjoyed writing it, and my teacher enjoyed it, and I think I read it to the class, or she read part of it to the class, and my classmates seemed to enjoy it. So I thought, okay, well, over the summer, I'm going to turn this into a full-length novel. I'm just going to expand on the scenarios and go into what happens with each of these characters on the deserted island. I didn't get very far because as a junior high school student, I realized that I would rather be outside playing with my friends during the summer than sitting in my family's basement typing away on our old Macintosh. But
sure.
At the very least, it was something I realized I enjoyed doing. So in high school, I took my first creative writing class. Really enjoyed that, and at that point, I started keeping a journal of story ideas. So I obviously used some for that class, but then as I moved through high school and through college, I would kind of build up these stories ideas, and so that's where Our Dried Voices originated in that notebook. The Friar's Lantern originated in that notebook, as well as some other stories. And then once I graduated college, I had this opportunity to play and coach for a baseball team in Sweden. So for the summer after my graduation, I was in Sweden, and my obligations there were basically coaching and participating in probably two practices a week, and then coaching a younger team one night a week and playing a doubleheader, so 2 games on every Saturday. So not a lot of time commitments. I had a lot of time for myself during the day. I wasn't able to get a part-time job because I didn't have the proper work visa for Sweden. So I had a lot of time to write, and that's basically when I cranked out the first draft of Our Dried Voices. But at that point, I was kind of hooked on it and was able to keep going throughout graduate school, and then even as I moved into a full-time career.
Time for our last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be wrapping up the interview with Greg. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Greg Hickey about his new book, The Friar's Lantern. Out of your particular journey, then, do you have advice for aspiring authors?
I would say really just make it a point to read and write every day. I've read comments and questions from aspiring writers who say, I really enjoyed writing. I started on this story. I'm 2 chapters in, but now I just don't like it anymore. And the problem is that, if as you continue with writing and you want to turn it into a career, or you want to turn it into something where you're publishing books and selling them, whether it's, full-time or it's on the side, it does become a job, and jobs is, even the best jobs are not always fun. They're always a little bit of work. So I think as aspiring writers, you have to make it a point to sit down in front of your computer every day or open your notebook or whatever it is and put some words on the page. One, to see if you actually enjoy the practice of writing enough to keep doing it. And two, because if you have any aspirations of doing this and publishing books and making money from those books, that's what you're going to have to do. Is just get in front of a computer regularly and produce words. And, it doesn't have to be something where you have to quit your job and you need to do this 8 hours a day and, go broke and go move in with your parents because you don't have any money. But, you have to find time in your day where you're going to be able to produce some written content. And at the same time, I think it's important to read stories, read books, see not only what other ideas are out there, but how stories work, how great authors structure their books, how they introduce characters, how they move their plots along. So obviously read for entertainment, but also read for understanding of how these authors are making stories work for them.
Speaking of reading, as you were talking about, are there genres or authors that you particularly enjoy when you read for yourself?
I don't know that I focus on one particular genre. I guess I tend to read the books that I like to write, or I guess rather I might say I write the books I tend to like to read. So stories that are entertaining but also have some sort of underlying idea to them, some underlying cause or drive to the story or commentary on the world we live in or the world we want to live in. So authors like Ayn Rand or Albert Camus or George Orwell, authors who are kind of taking these entertaining stories but also infusing them with some big ideas and some pretty heavy substance behind the plot. So it could be, science fiction, I think, does a good job of this, but these stories certainly aren't limited to science fiction. Obviously, a ton of literary fiction does this. Historical fiction can do it. There's some crime fiction that does it. It really, I kind of gravitate to just authors who are able to convey some weightier messages behind their stories.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you have a website, so can you tell people what your website is as well as where they might be able to interact with you on social media?
Absolutely. So my website is Greg Hickey Writes, so my name and then Writes, WRITES, GregHickeyWrites.com. That's probably the best way to find me on the internet. You can go there to contact me, to find all my social media channels. I'm on Facebook at Greg Hickey Writes. I'm on Twitter at Greg Hickey 5. Those are my two main social media platforms. But I think the easiest way is probably for readers to either go through links in this podcast if you're going to put them up, or to go directly to my website, and there are links to all my social media pages there.
Okay, thank you. And do you have a newsletter or anything on your website that people can sign up for?
I do, yes. And as part of my newsletter, what I'm doing right now is I've written a short prequel to the Friar's Lantern, which is called The Theory of Anything. It is only available to subscribers to my newsletter. The Theory of Anything basically goes through the incident leading up to the trial of Dr. David Solon. So Dr. Solon is a college professor who, in the Friar's Lantern, as I mentioned, is on trial for murder. And The Theory of Anything kind of goes through the events that led to him being arrested and then put on trial.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. Cool. Thank you. So, Greg, we've talked about a lot of different things, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you were hoping to talk about in terms of the new book or writing in general, just anything that we haven't covered?
No, I think we covered some pretty good ground. I guess I would just, again, recommend if readers are interested in kind of seeing my writing style, seeing some of the ideas that I address and how I address them, to visit my website, check out the Theory of Anything. It should be pretty easy for readers to figure out where to go. It should be right on the front page of my website, how to get a copy of the Theory of Anything delivered to your inbox.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I know that you are still going into your day job, even, with some of the craziness going on in the world. So I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me about your book.
Oh, thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate your time. And again, thank you very much for all the insightful questions.
Thank you once again to Greg for taking the time to speak to me about his book, The Friar's Lantern, as well as his first book and what else he's been working on. I really appreciate it. Thank you, as always, to you for joining me for this podcast. As I mentioned at the beginning, I do have copies to give away of The Friar's Lantern. So if you would like a chance to win a copy of this book, all you have to do is go to GSMC Book Review Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram and comment on this post. It's episode 223, interview with Greg Hickey. Comment with a choice that you have made in the last week or so that's been directly related to this crazy coronavirus we're all dealing with right now. My choice is that I chose to go to Costco on Monday because we needed some staples and I was dreading it. It sounded like the worst possible idea ever, and I'd been putting it off, but I finally chose to go on Monday, and it was lovely. It really wasn't that bad. It was actually way better than a regular day at Costco. So my choice worked out pretty well. So tell me about that choice again on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and you will be entered to win a copy of this Choose Your Own Adventure book for adults, The Friar's Lantern. Join me again on Tuesday when I will be speaking with author Armarna Forbes, about her young adult science fiction fantasy book, Dead Remnants. That will be again on Tuesday. In the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. I hope you are staying safe, helping to flatten that curve, not hoarding toilet paper, and I hope your weekend involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.